Hi, thanks for joining a strategic check-in. I get a lot of questions whether CDC has a strategic planning approach that it authorizes or canonizes. And the short answer is no, but the longer answer is that in the years I've been doing work at CDC and my colleagues at CDC have been doing strategic planning work with CDC programs, we've landed on a few kind of practical ways to approach strategic planning, whether it's large scale or short scale. And what we're going to talk about today is how to use program roadmaps as a helpful tool to do that. Right. Let me start off with something many of you may have heard before. It is a fact that if you blindfold someone, you put them in a large field, and you tell them to walk forward in a straight line, within minutes and without fail, they will walk in a circle. I don't know what the evolutionary value of this is, but it is in fact the case. In fact, it's worse than that. If you're lost in a snowstorm, you'll think you're walking in a straight line. You'll actually be walking in a circle. If you're swimming in the ocean, you'll be sure you're swimming in a straight line. In fact, slowly but surely, you're swimming in an arc. What that means, though, for us today is that the tendency of our programs to walk in a circle is very high unless they have a destination or a lighthouse in the distance. And that's what we're going to talk about today, why program roadmaps are so important, because they offer for us a destination in the distance that helps orient our activities. The starting assumptions for today are that most organizations resist planning and evaluation. They resist them because they see them both as burdensome and complicated. The good news is that sometimes a check-in is enough, not a full-scale 5-year plan or a full-scale 5-year strategy, and that simple tools are best, or shall we start simple and work your way up to complex. Here are the top 5 things anybody needs to know about anything, whether it's your program, whether it's CDC, whether it's your family. One is the big need to which it is contributing. What's that downstream distal lighthouse in the distance? Secondly is the distinction between the what is it you do, and the so what, who or what changes because of what you do. Those first two things give you a very, very basic roadmap to start with. The next 3 things then help you zoom in on strategic check-in. The third one is your accountable outcome. Where in that scheme of so what do I need to get to be considered successful? Then if you don't get to that accountable outcome, there's really only 2 answers. One is your activities aren't strong enough. So what does it mean for my activities to be strong? And the final one would be there's something going on in the larger environment, a contextual or situational factor that's getting in your way. So we're going to show you how roadmaps help you cut to the chase on all of these and lead to the kind of strategic insights you need for a quick strategic check-in or even for a big 5-year strategic plan. So here's what a simple roadmap looks like. Activities lead to a chain of outcomes that we usually think of as short-term, intermediate, or long-term, or some people call them proximal, intermediate, and distal. Activities are what the program does. They're the what of the program. The outcomes are the so what of the program. Who or what will change because of what you do. Process use is one of the key things that comes out of this road mapping process. Even though logic models and roadmaps are part of the evaluation approach we use at CDC, in strategic planning, what we find is that a lot of the value of our evaluation approaches comes not from the findings we receive down the road, but from the act of doing this upfront conceptualization of your program. So process use is when the influence and the program improvement comes not from the findings of an evaluation or performance measurement project, but from the insights you get during the tasks involved in doing an evaluation. So what we're going to emphasize today is what we call prospective use, insights you'll get by simply having to think systematically about your program. All right. What's the immediate payoff? Well, we know the long-term payoff. It's a really good set of measures, but there's an immediate payoff from process use, and that is we find out now what we need to do now or immediately to improve the ability of activities to drive us to the accountable outcomes. That's what we're going to call the output discussion. To own factors in the larger environment so that we can address them so they no longer get in our way. We're going to call that the moderator discussion. And or sometimes we have to accommodate to those factors in the environment because they're laws of gravity. Those are immediate payoffs we get from thinking in a roadmap way, and we'll see how each of those is so important for strategic thinking. Okay. Your program's roadmap. So where do these roadmaps come from? Well, first off, keeping them simple is always the best bet. So I'm going to show you a variety of formats, each of which would work perfectly depending upon the situation for what we're trying to get out of the roadmap. Right? So the simple roadmap looks at activities and long-term outcomes. What versus so what. It's very rare that that's enough detail for us to think strategically. However, that's good at telling us what's that big downstream need to which the program is contributing. It's very hard for a lot of programs to think of that because they think the act of writing it is the act of being held accountable for it. We'll see in the next half hour how important it is for me to understand my lighthouse in the distance so I walk in a straight line, even though my journey may never take me all the way to that lighthouse. So worksite training is an example we're going to use. And so this is a combination of a whole bunch of things going on at CDC. If I think of a worksite training effort, the lighthouse in the distance is likely organizational change, a culture of health and safety, right? Does that tell me much? Am I going to hope and think that my worksite training is going to single-handedly be responsible for that? Probably not. But I want to keep my eye on that prize. The more important part of the roadmap, once I've defined the what and that distal lighthouse, is that short-term and intermediate so what that gets me there. So in worksite training, that's a pretty easy one. I'm going to use the standard kind of Kirkpatrick stages. For me to get to number 4, organizational change, the culture of health and safety, my worksite training needs to contribute to knocking over those 3 previous dominoes. People need to be happy with the training. They need to walk away with the knowledge, attitude, and belief, the KAB, and the skills they need. And then we need to see those behaviors sustained on the job. And that's what's going to get me out to that lighthouse of organizational change. Right? Now, here's a case we're going to run through very, very quickly just to illustrate this with something a little bit more complex than my 5-box logic model for worksite training. This is a made-up case. It's a composite of a whole bunch of things CDC does that are like this. So read along with me, and then we'll show what the roadmap for this program might look like. And then we'll show later how that might pay off strategically. So Eastside Health Center, a large publicly funded community-based health services provider, is implementing an HIV/AIDS prevention program focusing on minority young people in its community. The intent is to raise knowledge about HIV and AIDS, change attitudes and beliefs, and reduce high-risk behaviors. So far, we've learned a lot about the so what of this program. Now we're going to learn about the what. The approach, i.e. the approach that Eastside is going to use, is prevention education in middle schools and high schools. And you see that's going to be a mix of formal presentations, teacher-led small group discussions, and distribution of educational materials that'll be taken home and shared with parents. A second what is community-based education. They're going to train young adults from community organizations and churches as peer educators. They're going to do one-on-one or small group street work approaches with hard-to-reach populations. And then the third what is community-wide publicity and advertising. Posters and brochures displayed in various sites throughout the neighborhoods, community centers, schools, stores, barbershops, also bus cards, billboards, and PSAs. So now we know the so what and the what of this effort. The roadmap for this may be as simple as these simple 4-column tables. 2 columns of activities. It looks to me like selecting and training youth, developing materials and messages are fundamental or infrastructural for those other activities to happen. On the right-hand side, you see something that heads me to that lighthouse in the distance, which is reduced HIV risk behavior, reduced incidence of HIV, and there's one sort of marker along the way. Educational materials are brought home. Sometimes this is enough and sometimes it's helpful. I'm going to preach today that you're really going to be better off by trying to draw in some boxes and arrows, what we call the underlying logic or the underlying theory of the program. Because you're going to detect some potential differences of opinion and potential differences of theory of how it is those activities on the left are going to get you to those outcomes on the right. So here's one example. If I look back at that activity there, I can see that all of those activities can lead to those outcomes. When I draw in the arrows, in this case I call it dosage. Everything I do as an activity is geared as an independent way of getting into the head of the risky kid. So you can see I have sort of 3 clumps of activities in column 2. Each of them independently gets me to changes in knowledge, attitude, and belief of the target youth. Nothing wrong with this. This could be exactly the underlying theory of the program. However, in discussing this with people, I may instead have identified this theory, and I call this theory social ecology. So in a social ecology theory, you see that that northern route gets right into the head of the kid. That middle route of distributing educational materials gets into the head of the kid by convincing the kid's parents to discuss and reinforce messages. And that bottom route of community education campaigns gets into the head of the kid eventually because it changes community environment and community norms. Sometimes this matters, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, we're going to see that this so what here, this what so what roadmap is absolutely essential for defining what the best way is to get to the outcomes we need to get to. Right? So at this point, what we have is more than we think we do. We have a very simple roadmap. We have a distinction between where our what stops and our so what starts. We have a sense of our lighthouse in the distance, and we've drawn in a few boxes and arrows to give us a general sense of the underlying pathways in theory to get there. All of that's very, very good, but that only now sets up the strategic discussion we want to have. So the first strategic discussion we need to have is, am I responsible all the way out to the lighthouse? And if not, where in that chain of outcomes am I held accountable or responsible? So choosing the key accountable outcomes, or what I call staking our claim, which is a term from prospecting or surveying where you stake off all the land you own, you stick a stake in the ground and you say, beyond this I don't own it, but I own everything up to it. Right? The trouble with staking our claim is that it points to one outcome, but that outcome and everything that precedes it needs to be so far out that it's relevant. I need a sufficiently downstream or distal outcome that if I achieve it, stakeholders are going to say, boy, this was really worth investing in. Contrasting with that, though, it needs to be sufficiently upstream that I can imagine if I do a really good job, I ought to get to that outcome. So if I have relevance but not responsiveness, I'm setting myself up for failure. If I have responsiveness but not relevance, I'm setting myself up to be looked at as inconsequential or unimportant as a program. The difficulty, of course, is that the further out we move in that roadmap or that logic model, the more relevance goes up. Man, if I can achieve the lighthouse in the distance, God bless me, but responsiveness goes down. My ability of my efforts to make that happen is going to be diminished because of outside factors, just scale or whatever. So what I'm really looking for in this accountable outcome discussion is some sort of sweet spot where it's far enough out that people will say, holy mackerel, this is really a major contributor to that big public health problem in the distance. Yet I can imagine that with the right effort and strategic attention, my program efforts can get me there. Sometimes that lives in the long-term outcomes and impacts. In fact, one of the problems we do in strategic planning and evaluation is to always assume our accountable outcome is on the right-hand side. And that scares the heck out of programs, and it often causes them to avoid planning and evaluation just because their ship is so small, that sea is so large. The reality more often, and the advantage of a roadmap, is that it gives us a variety of ways by which our activities get to that long-term outcome and gives us a variety of potential accountable outcomes that will be major drivers that are short of that long-term outcome. So the accountable outcome almost always, not always, but almost always is going to live more proximally than that long-term outcome like morbidity and mortality, incidence, and prevalence. So let's look at our example of worksite training. We had our four Kirkpatrick stages, the fourth one being an organizational change that's routinized, a culture of health and safety. We decided in some discussion in the work group on which this case was based that sure, we know we can get to KAB and skills. We know our worksite training can lead to KAB and skills from a responsiveness point of view, but from a relevance point of view, is anyone going to buy that as an investment worth making in worksite training? And the answer quickly was no. If all we do is change KAB and skills, and we don't see that turning into behavior change, we're just not going to be relevant enough. So the question becomes, can we be so relevant we can get to organizational change, culture of health and safety? Well, for training alone, we didn't believe that we could do that either. There are too many outside factors. So we landed in the middle. Accountable outcome for worksite training is that KAB and skills change, of course, but that leads to the behaviors being taught, sustained on the job. Now, saying that doesn't make it true, but saying it gives us something to anchor to when we start thinking strategically about, are we getting there? How can we get there? What can we do better? So in this case, what does it mean to have selected behaviors sustained on the job? Well, we could unpack those, and here's 4 or 5 of them that we came up with. And the advantage of having this specificity is when we start thinking of something vague like worksite training or vague like knowledge, attitude, and belief change, we can anchor onto these behaviors we actually want sustained on the job, and that helps us figure out what needs to be in the training, what kind of knowledge, attitude, belief changes need to happen. So I picked these 5: participation in physical activity, a healthy diet which is sustained at home, the organization itself conducts formal safety risk assessments, people in the organization know when an incident has occurred, and people in the organization know how to and why to report an incident, right? Those are not the only behaviors we want sustained on the job, but those were 5 that jumped to the top of the list when we discussed this, right? If I look at the East Side Social Ecology Roadmap, which is the one I'm going to use today, same question. As I overlay responsiveness and relevance on that logic model, where is my sweet spot? Where's the accountable outcome that's so far downstream, someone would say, holy mackerel, this is really an important effort. You've done a great job contributing to solving a public health problem, yet sufficiently upstream that I could imagine a really good job at East Side activities producing that outcome. Once again, I bet everyone lands on changes in knowledge, attitude, and belief of target youth as something we can produce with regularity, be proud of, and yet from a relevance point of view, someone's going to say, how in the heck is that going to decrease incidence of HIV and AIDS, our lighthouse in the distance, if it doesn't lead to some sort of behavior change? And in short order, I bet we would conclude that for Eastside, just like for worksite training, the accountable outcome is that we actually see decreased HIV risk behavior in the targeted youth. Now again, that doesn't make it true, it just gives us something to anchor on so we can be thinking strategically about how to focus our activities and our outcomes to help us get there. Right? So what do we know now? Now we have our roadmap, we have our underlying program theory, and in that skein of pathways, we've identified the 1 or 2 big outcomes we have to get to. Now remember, that's the outer bound outcome. It's not the only outcome we have to get to. We have to get that far, but we own everything leading up to it. So the question now becomes strategically, if I don't get to that outcome, why am I not getting there? And there's really only 2 answers. One is I'm not doing my activities correctly, what we call the strong strategic action, which we'll turn to right now with the output discussion. And then later we'll turn to there's something larger going on in the environment that's helping me or hobbling me, what we call the moderator discussion. The strong strategic action discussion leads us naturally to this concept of outputs. I've often resisted using outputs in my work at CDC because it tends to be a very confusing term. Half the audience confuses it with outcomes, the half that doesn't confuse it with outcomes confuses it with inputs. But used correctly, the output discussion is really the focus for a lot of strategic check-in work. So outputs is really the bridge between your activities and your outcomes. And so outputs are the place where you get to define what does it mean to do my activities well? What do strong activities mean? So in the case of worksite training, I know I'm trying to get down to number 3 there, behaviors sustained on the job. So my question is, what does it mean to do my worksite activities strong or strongly enough or well enough that I'll knock over those dominoes and get to behavior sustained on the job? So in this case, it's very easy. Now that I know where my worksite training activities need to take me, I'm going to ask myself, what does good mean? What does well mean? So here's some things in a quick discussion we came up with. So these are key attributes of activities to ensure those outcomes, including all the way down to that accountable outcome, are reached. The content of the health and safety training should explain why it should be done. The content should offer options and not just an ideal, because we can so seldom implement the ideal. We should provide real-time experience during the training. The training needs to include reinforcing materials, especially since some of the safety instances or the safety incidents are not going to occur very frequently. And we should personalize the content to the situation of the person as opposed to just general regulations that guide all training. Now you can see how this gives us much better of a handle on what it means to do the worksite training well than the simple act of counting how many people got trained or how many trainings were done. Where do these come from? They might come from practice wisdom. They might come from the literature. The reality is if you're close to an intervention, the act of saying, now that I know that activity X needs to lead to outcome Y is pretty simple. And the act of saying, now that I know I need to achieve that outcome, what implications does it have for how I do my activities is easier still. Sometimes you're drawing on a great literature. Sometimes you're just drawing on the School of Hard Knocks. Sometimes you're drawing on practice wisdom. In each case, it's better than simply counting things as your outputs. Right? So with eSide, let's look at that exact same thing. So I've color-coded 3 parts of this roadmap. So do one-to-one street ed, the roadmap tells me, is intended to lead to changes in knowledge, attitude, and belief of the targeted youth. That's in red. In green, we can see that an activity called distributing educational materials is supposed to lead to those materials being shared at home and the parents actually discussing and reinforcing the messages. The community campaign, the one on the bottom in blue, is a really big and complex task. I'm going to pull out just this idea of PSAs. I'm going to conduct a community campaign that includes PSAs. The purpose of those PSAs is to make community knowledge, attitude, and belief change in a supportive direction. So the question now becomes not how much street ed should I do, how many materials should I distribute, how many PSAs should I do. It becomes how do I do my street ed in a way that helps ensure knowledge, attitude, and belief change will occur. How do I distribute educational materials in a way that ensures they'll be shared at home and even discussed? And how do I do PSAs in a way that helps ensure that community knowledge, attitude, and belief will change? So I call this the plot thickens. The question I'm now trying to answer is, I want to do one-to-one street ed so good it will lead to knowledge, attitude, and belief change. Material distribution so good it will lead to materials shared and discussed. PSA campaigns so good it will lead to change in community knowledge, attitude, and belief. Once I start thinking that way, it becomes much easier for me to lock into the attributes or characteristics of street ed and material distribution or the PSA campaign. Now notice I'm not identifying here what that outcome is and if I've achieved it. I've already got that in my sights. I'm identifying instead how do I need to do those activities to get there. So I made up these outputs here, but they're very close to what we typically would see if we work this case in a class. The number of peer educators who have completed training, the number who meet demographics of targeted at-risk youth, right? So if I want to get to knowledge, attitude, and belief change of targeted youth, here's 2 characteristics I'm looking for in peer educators that will help me get there. They actually have been trained and they know what they're doing, and they happen to look like the people they're targeting. If I'm looking at the community campaign and I'm looking at the bus cards or the PSAs, let's say I was looking at the bus cards, it could be the percentage of buses with pre-tested bus cards or the percentage on the right routes with buses with bus cards. If I'm looking at street encounters with kids meeting a high-risk profile, the percentage of street encounters with an intake or a profile completed. If I'm trying to make sure that the materials are distributed to parents actually lead to discussions and sharing, the number of materials distributed directly to parents, they avoid using the kid as a conduit to get the materials out there, and the percentage of materials pre-tested for acceptability with parents, or perhaps coming with a guide or a discussion guide to ensure that when parents get them, they're going to do something other than freak out. Okay? Now, none of those assures I'm going to get my outcome. All of those do say, instead of just counting how many peer educators, how many bus cards, how many street encounters, what is it that I need to do in implementing that activity that will help ensure I get to the outcome of interest? Right? So what outputs tell us? What they tell us, not just quantity, but quality. What does it mean to do our activities right or to do our activities well? There are 2 uses for these, and we're most worried about the prospective use. The prospective use, meaning the use right now, the process use, is it clarifies what level of quality investment is needed, and it might cause us to have sticker shock. One of the biggest advantages of doing this prospectively is sticker shock. I said I was going to do training. The training's supposed to lead to X. What does that really imply for the kind of training I wanted to do? Well, I thought I might hand out a couple brochures. Oh my God, I actually have to engage with the kids. Right? So it may cause us to rethink or rescale our program. But what it does is it saves us in the long run from having to figure out why the heck the program failed downstream. Retrospectively, As evaluators, this helps us because we've just identified what the high bar for implementation is for our activities. That basically is going to be the focus of our process evaluation. As the program proceeds, we're always going to be asking the question, is the program being implemented as it was intended or as it's supposed to? And the outputs tell us that's exactly what we should be measuring. So now I've conquered what it means to do my activities well, and I'm still not getting to my accountable outcome. Then there's only one other answer that could be to blame for which I can take strategic action, and that is there's something going on in the larger context or situation. So if you think of your program as a seed you plant in the ground, gosh darn it, it grows just perfectly in the lab, so long as it's nurtured and watered, etc. You go out and plant it in 100 test plots, you feed it, you nurture it, you fertilize it. Something happens in half the plots that causes it to thrive. In the other half of the plots, it doesn't even germinate. You know there's something going on in the soil. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about now with what we call the moderator discussion. Our programs are planted in a context and a situation. If we do the best job possible, which is something that we know from the output discussion, and we still don't get our outcome, it's because we're neglecting something or failed to account for something going on in the context and situation. Right? In strategic planning, we often talk about a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And that can be very, very helpful for our strategic thinking. Where those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats live is in what we call killer assumptions. When in fact we don't get our outcomes, despite the fact we're producing these great outputs, it means there's some assumption we made that was not true, either in the inputs, the resources that someone was going to give us, or those external factors in the context and the assumptions, the external factors in the environment. And we call those killer assumptions to remind us there's always pain and suffering in our inputs. There's always pain and suffering in our context. What we're really looking for in this discussion is there some big thing out there such that if it doesn't exist, why am I bothering with the program? Because the program really can't achieve its outcomes. So some typical inputs to go there first: people, data, funding, facilities, relationships. These are all things we depend upon to mount our activities, and in many cases they exist. They don't exist at the ideal we like, but the program is scalable. But what we want to look at is every once in a while one of these things is so important that if we don't have it or don't have it at a certain level, the program simply can't succeed. All right? When I look at the Eastside HIV/AIDS prevention program and look at social ecology, the question might be, what's going on in the inputs? What assumptions am I making on the input side such that if it's not true, I'm not going to be able to get to that accountable outcome, which we decided was decreased HIV risk behavior. I got to tell you, after using this case a lot, I don't see a lot going on there. There's probably all kinds of pain and suffering I need to look at: the demographics of the community, the political will of the community, the degree to which the community really cares about this issue. But I'm not seeing any big killer assumption on the input side. Most of the inputs we typically think of in a program, we would get enough of them at least to scale the program, right? But here's a couple that might come up that you would think about: approval from the school board, approval from the bus company, prior sufficient info on community norms and demographics and values, prior and sufficient inventory of relevant and useful materials. I don't think any of those rises to the level of a killer assumption, but those are all potential sources of pain and suffering that if I don't think about them in advance, it might be hard to implement my activities and get my outcomes. And conversely, if I think about those in advance, with a little bit of help and a little bit of change, I can probably make those inputs sing. So what do inputs tell us? What they tell us is the resource platform needed to mount our program, of course, but in particular, they tell us what are the killer assumptions, the handful of things I'm assuming have to be in place. As with outputs, we use it prospectively and retrospectively. We're more concerned today strategically with prospective use. Once I know what those inputs are, and once I know if I have a killer assumption, then really I can take action right now to add activities to ensure the inputs, or I can decide, gosh darn it, I'm only going to forge ahead where those inputs are in place. I'm only going to forge ahead because otherwise I'm headed for sure failure. Retrospectively, as evaluators, as I'm listening to this discussion, I'm listening to people talk about killer assumptions, the note I'm making is, boy, as we monitor this project, that really looks where the devil is in the details. I'm going to be sure that one of the evaluation questions we keep asking is, did these folks get those errant inputs? If they don't, then the question is always going to be, I know why we didn't get to the outcome, and next time we need to solve this errant input problem. We ask the same set of questions when we deal with those contexts, or the fancy name evaluators use is moderators. So in the SWOT analysis here, what we're really looking for are big contextual factors, and those fall into four flavors. You're not looking for problems in every one of these flavors, but these are four lenses you always put on your environment because they one or two or three or even four of them may be responsible for problems you'll have in achieving your outcomes. And they spell PEST. It's called a PEST analysis. And that's a sort of an unfortunate term. You'd rather be more asset oriented and say PETS or STEP. But the reality is PEST is really more helpful because it reminds us if we don't pay attention to the context, something's going to get in our way. And it's going to get in our way perhaps at a point too late in the process to change it. So P is political, E is economic, S is social, things like community norms, etc. T is technology. All of these are things where we make assumptions about the larger environment. We make assumptions about the characteristics of the soil. And again, we're not looking for every problem in all four of these categories. We're looking for things that constitute killer assumptions. If that assumption is not true, if that factor is not present, why am I bothering with the program? I'm going to run into a brick wall. So let's look at worksite training. Worksite training, I was going to implement worksite training, get happy trainees, KAB changes, behavior sustained on the job. That was my contribution to the organizational change and culture. That was the lighthouse in the distance. Right? The moderating factors that might keep me from getting there, no matter how well I do my worksite training, are supervisor attitudes and expectations. That's out of my control. This training is geared to workers. Lack of access to food and facilities at home. I can preach all I want to about good food and good facilities for physical activity. If the access isn't there, the person can't activate the behavior. Lack of resources for wellness and safety within the organization. Lack of reinforcement, the decay of the knowledge, attitude, and belief in the motivation. Fog of war and competing priorities, basically the same thing. So much else going on, it's very hard to reinforce or keep your eye on that pathway that's most important to you. Now, identifying this can be depressing, and we're not doing it to depress ourselves. We're doing it because forewarned is forearmed. And we'll see how the identification of moderating factors isn't the strategic part. The strategic part is then sorting through these moderating factors and deciding what actions might we take to turn them in our direction when they're killer assumptions. All right. So let's look at east side. So in east side, when I look at this, same logic model I used before, we spent a lot of time looking at what the outputs would need to look like for street ed to turn into KAB change, for educational materials to turn into materials shared and discussed at home, for elements of the community campaign to change into community KAB changes. Now we're asking a different question. We're saying even if I get those outputs right for those key activities and I'm still not getting to decreased HIV risk behavior, what is it going on in the outside environment that I can anticipate might be getting in my way? Right. So here's some east side moderators. And again, as I go through these, remember, I'm not looking to address all of them. I'm asking myself, are some of these so big, are they so monumental that they constitute killer assumptions? I can't possibly get to my program's outcomes unless I conquer them. So politically, parent and school board and the school relationship could be very, very bad. You can see how many activities, especially those activities of materials shared at home, would be very, very hard to achieve an outcome if that relationship is bad. Health department school relationship could be very bad. Well, the entire thing about that northern route has to happen pretty much in the school. And if that relationship is bad, you can see how that's going to get in the way. Testing mania may be so important in the school district that much as we don't want kids engaging in risky behaviors, we really don't care so long as they keep their math and their reading scores up. The economic piece, when we look at the community campaign, if it depends upon bus ridership and a bus campaign, well, golly, that really is not going to help us unless the right people are riding the bus. On the social side, there are all kinds of communications going on here, and it could be that norms and values about risk behaviors and solutions are going to get in our way and constrain what we can and can't say. It could be it's a very diverse community, or a community that's very religiously diverse with very different opinions about language, or very different literacy rates. And then finally, technologically, in this case, I'm trying to get people to activate a behavior that requires some technology, condoms, clean needles, or whatever. If there's no access to those things, then I can do all the knowledge, attitude, and belief change I want to. I'm not ever going to get to that accountable outcome. Now, again, as I'm going through these, I'm not looking to depress myself with all the things that can get in my way. I'm looking to ask myself, are any of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 moderators such a big deal that I have to address it or I can't get to my accountable outcome? Right? So moderators, what do they tell us? They tell us the exact same thing that the inputs tell us, but writ large as contextual factors. So they tell us what context factors need to be aligned for the activities to turn into outcomes, and in particular, which ones are such big barriers they constitute killer assumptions. The perspective use, again, just like with inputs, is the most important one here. I want to know early because then I can add activities to remove the bad or assure a good context, or I can make the decision to only implement these activities in a context that's already favorable. Or I can choose to forge ahead to sure failure, and I already know then where my sure failure is going to come from. Retrospectively, that's what I'm doing. I'm sitting here listening as an evaluator and saying they're going to forge ahead. If they forge ahead and it doesn't get there, it's because they're not paying attention to this killer assumption. I'm going to make sure that I'm measuring that because that's going to explain what we do the next time. Now, the most important thing about this, as I said, is not just the identification of the problems, but the identification of what we call mitigating factors or mitigating actions. If I know I have this problem, what is it I can do to change that input in a supportive direction, to change that context in a supportive direction? Right? So here's some selected actions in the case of worksite planning, that worksite training that we can take to mitigate those moderating factors. So we had a moderating factor called supervisors' attitudes and expectations. If we felt that was a killer assumption, we'd have to identify that. We'd have to figure out how to address and change that killer assumption. Two things we can do: add consistent messages in supervisor training, or push others to create standard operating procedures or policies to induce supervisor cooperation. So once there's a standard operating procedure in place, the attitude doesn't really matter. The supervisor has to follow it. Lack of reinforcement, decay of knowledge, attitude, and belief, refresher training, or written materials. Now again, do I need to address every single moderating factor? Perhaps yes, perhaps not. I need especially to deal with those that are going to be such killer assumptions I can't get to my outcome unless I address it. All right. Continuing along, competing priorities in the fog of war. Highlight the consequences of not doing things right. In all of my communication, talk about the instances where you pay me later because you didn't do it now. Lack of resources for quality and safety. This is a continual problem. People will look at this as such a steep hill to climb, they'll do nothing. How do we get around that? By arraying the solutions from cheap to expensive. And maybe if it turns out there are only expensive solutions, using it as a way to build a constituency to get more budget for these efforts. Now, are these things going to work? Maybe yes, maybe no. Right now, we're thinking strategically. We're saying our answer right now is to assume these problems are not problems, which is not the case. Some of them are killer assumptions. Our assumption right now is to only do this in places where the soil is fertile. That's nice work if you can get it, but it's not always the case. And the final thing is where, in fact, we have some assumptions there that are really going to get in our way, asking ourselves what's in our control that we can do as a program that can turn that moderating factor in a positive direction. So let's look at East Side. East Side, we already talked about the moderators earlier. We had several political ones, an economic one, two social ones, and a technological one. At this point, we want to be looking at which ones constitute killer assumptions, and where we have some killer assumptions, the question would be, what is it we can do to try and move that moderator in a supportive direction? All right. So to summarize, right now we know a ton about our program that we didn't know before, and we did it all with a very, very simple little roadmap. We know the lighthouse in the distance, what we call the need to which it's contributing, but we don't freak out assuming if we don't get to that lighthouse, the program has failed. Rather, in number two, we lay out a roadmap of what versus so what. What do we do as activities, and what are the dominoes that we knock over, things exogenous to our activities that help us make at least a contribution to that need. Thirdly, we know that somewhere in that row of dominoes, we have to get to be successful. In some occasions, it's the lighthouse in the distance, it's that big need. It often is short of that. That's not the only thing we have to achieve, but we have to get that far out for the program to be deemed successful. Once we know those three things in our roadmap, then that leads to a really important strategy discussion. If I want to get to that accountable outcome, how strongly and in what ways do I need to do my activities to get there? And what assumptions am I making about inputs, context, situational factors that if they're not true, they're going to get in my way, and hence I need to address them now. So those are the 5 things any program needs to know. Now, how do we put it all together? Again, I emphasize at the start that we can use this for very, very quick strategic check-in. We can also use it for more full-blown strategic planning. A lot of programs resist strategic planning because they see it as complicated, taking meeting after meeting, ending up with 200-page documents. We'll see that this road mapping process leads you to enough information to turn into that if you want to, but it also leads to enough information for you to cut to the chase in a few short ways that might benefit you in a specific situation. So we're going to look at all those different ways in short order. So the first thing that the road mapping does is it helps you identify what we call key strategic issues. No matter where you take these, you might take these into sets of goals and objectives. You might just address them as one-offs. You may come up with an action plan for the next year. No matter what you're always starting with in this discussion is key strategic issues. What are the issues I've identified strategically through this road mapping discussion? I know I have an accountable outcome. Which of my outcome pathways are weakest? I know I have an accountable outcome and some weak pathways. What are the activities that are driving those pathways? Because that's probably what I need to improve. I may have really good outcome pathways, really good activities, but are there some moderating factors that are out there that are really, really causing all of my problems? All 3 of those constitute strategic issues, and in a given situation, you may have 1, 2, or all 3 of those to contend with. Right? So looking at each side again, remember, we identified a handful of activities and we identified the outcomes that we were trying to get to, right? In this case, I put into red the things I think are kind of weak. So if I'm trying to get to HIV risk behavior of targeted youth, let's say after examination, I conclude that where I'm really running into trouble is I'm not getting the knowledge, attitude, and belief change of the high-risk kids. If I ask myself why that's not occurring, there are 2 reasons. One is parents are not discussing and reinforcing messages like I hope they would, and that's attributable to the activity called distributing educational materials. So when I try and solve this problem strategically, I'm going to be looking for what do I do or do differently that's going to incent parents to discuss and reinforce messages. The other reason I'm not getting changes in knowledge, attitude, and belief, if in the high-risk kids, if my logic model is right, is that my one-to-one street ed is not effective. So I'm going to use the output discussion to remind myself, what do I need to goose up about one-to-one street ed to enhance the chances it'll change that knowledge, attitude, and belief? And then finally, down there in the community campaign, I want to move to supportive environment and community norms. The big thing I'm doing to move that is the community campaign. And I've called out 2 things I think are weak, my PSAs and my bus cards. I'm going to be looking again from the output discussion, what is it we could be doing differently that ensures PSAs and bus cards actually lead to supportive environment and community norms. Right? Now, whether I take this in the direction of setting goals and objectives, take this in the direction of just making some strategic observations is totally up to you and totally up to the situation and who the audience for this discussion is. Right? The 3 choices would be I can list and address the key strategic issues as one-offs, might be a couple of one-pagers. I can create a quickie strategic plan. And another thing I can do, and this is sort of a follow-along to 1 and 2, is I can use it to affirm my vision and mission. So let me show you how the road mapping we just did makes it easier for you to cut to the chase in any of those 3 strategy tasks. Right? So let's look at Eastside again. We identified three outcome pathways that were weak. The community and weak meant we're not getting to the accountable outcome of changing behavior. Community norms are not changing, parents are not discussing at home, and the attitudes of the street kids, that is the high risk street kids, are not changing. Right? We already know from the logic model or the roadmap what activities are driving those outcome pathways. Community norms are not changing because we have bad messages or coverage of community PSA and bus campaign. We identified earlier that the PSA and the bus campaign were the weakest part of our community campaign. The parents are not discussing at home because there's something wrong with the materials being distributed. We determined it was that the parent materials lack guidance to guide parents through what's really an ornery discussion. The attitudes of street kids are not changing. We determined it was something wrong with our one-to-one street ed, and in the output discussion, we figured out it was poor choices in one-to-one street ed. In addition, we have these moderating factors getting in our way that we identified earlier. Cultural norms in the riskiest groups don't support a parent discussion. Let's say this is a community with tons and tons of refugee populations. Well, this is not the kind of thing that parents and kids may discuss. The political relationship of the community, the school leadership, and the school board, all of that might have been fractured or fractious. And thirdly, we're going to assume there's a big outside emphasis from the state to pressure school time to focus on academics because the school gets rewarded for high test scores. Each of these are going to be things that exist strategically, and each of these are things we can turn into strategic action. So how do we address these? Community norms not changing, the bad messages or coverage. Well, what did we learn from the output discussion? We probably flipped that on its head. What would a good message look like? What would good coverage look like? What buses should it be on? What should the messages be on those buses? Parents are not discussing at home. Parent materials lack guidance. Well, what did we learn from the output discussion? The things that should be in that guidance, how to guide your kid through an ornery discussion, how to get your kid to turn off their phone and turn off the TV and talk about sex and risky behavior. The attitudes of street kids are not changing. What did we learn from the output discussion? Well, we probably learned that the one-to-one street ed was not engaging people, it was handing out information, and or that the one-to-one street educators were not the right people. On moderating factors, we already have a lot to play with in responding to moderating factors strategically. Cultural norms in the riskiest groups are not supportive. Well, when we had that mitigating action step discussion, we probably identified a whole bunch of things we can do as a program to switch those cultural norms in the appropriate or supportive direction. The political relationship of the community, the pressure to focus school time on academics. We may conclude that those are relevant. We may conclude they're not relevant. We may conclude they're sort of relevant, but they don't really constitute strategic issues if they that rise to the level of killer assumptions. Right? If they do, then the question would be, what did we learn from the mitigating action step discussion about how to improve that political relationship, how to deal with or push back on the emphasis to focus school time on academics? Let's say we want to take it beyond just one-offs and sort of free list things we can be doing differently in the next year and create a quick strategic plan. And that's what a lot of people are called upon to do. Everyone feels a little bit better when they've got some goals and objectives they can show their boss. They've laid out some strategies and priorities for the next year. Again, this road mapping and all the work we've done sets this up for us. It's just a matter of packaging. It's all the stuff that we used in approach number one. We're just going to package it in the language we're used to using in strategic planning. So in our roadmap, we can look at the goals as the right-hand side, the objectives as those short-term and intermediate outcomes, which probably includes our accountable outcome, and then the strategies as the activities and outputs we're trying to produce. So in the case of east side, I'm going to look to the far right side for my goal. I'm going to look in the middle for my objectives, and I'm going to look to the left for my strategies and activities. And again, we're just packaging stuff that we've already seen in other slides and already seen in the previous exercise where we use that to come up with a really quickie kind of one-off, what do we do next year? Right? So the goal, well, when I use the roadmap for east side, the goal clearly is that right-hand side, reduction in HIV risk behavior, especially among targeted youth. What are my objectives going to be? My objectives are solidly going to be about the three pathways I found were weak. You remember, I already named them. Community norms don't change, parents don't discuss, attitudes of street kids are not changing. Here, as a strategic plan, I simply turn those on their head into an objective or a smart objective. If community norms are not changing, what's my objective? By a date to be named, an increase in community-wide norms that support adoption of key risk behaviors. Parents aren't discussing at home. Well, as an objective, by a date to be named, an increase in households where discussions of risk behavior are taking place. Attitudes are not changing. By date to be named, an increase in support of knowledge, attitude, and belief among these riskiest kids. I also know how I'm going to address those on the strategy side or the tactics or activity side. And why do I know it? The same way I knew it in number one. We learn from the output discussions and we learn from the mitigating action discussions the ways in which we need to do those activities differently to move those weak pathways in the right direction. It's just that now in a strategic plan, I'm going to turn that into language that looks more like strategic planning. I'm going to turn that into a format that looks more like what I see in a strategic plan. Right? So here's my objective. By a date to be named, an increase in community-wide norms supporting adoption of key risk behaviors. What I learned from the discussion, bad messages were to blame. We had an output discussion that says, golly, we need to do better. Here's what better means. That I now turn into a strategy. Identify unique subsegments of the community and design and target messages to them using appropriate channels. You can see how there's a straight line of sight from things I probably learned from the output discussion. What was wrong with my messages? What was wrong with the coverage? Well, the message was too broadcast. The coverage was too spotty. It was not literate enough. It wasn't in the right places. Well, that turns into my strategy. I'm going to frame it assertively as now I'm going to get to an increase in community-wide norms because my strategy is going to be better. It's going to be identifying unique subsegments and designing and target messages to them using the channels that will reach them. Same thing with objective 2. I want to get to a world where households are actually discussing risk behaviors with the risky kid. The issue identified was parent materials lack guidance. The output discussion was, gosh, well, what do I need to do to get parents that guidance? I now turn that into a strategy. Implement social media strategy to encourage discussion. That's something that works its way around the parent-kid relationship. And develop and test discussion script and guidance and FAQs. If you're a parent like me who gets something in the mail that says discuss sex and drugs with your kid, you're going to freak out. But if it comes with a script and some guidance and some FAQs on how to engage, I'm probably much more likely to try that. Now again, are these things true? No, but you can see how much better this is than just flailing around wildly asking yourself, why the heck aren't people discussing things? By using the roadmap and by using that output discussion, I can come up with some viable and hopefully evidence-based or at least practice wisdom-based strategies that will actually move that objective forward. The third one, an increase in support of knowledge, attitude, and belief. The same thing. We identified early that it was poor choices in one-to-one street ed. We had an output discussion that said, what do we need to do to make our street ed better? And that becomes our strategy. Select street educators that reflect the demographics. Create a call to action step to push with those reached so we know we're actually engaging them. And most importantly, do the street ed efforts where the risky kids gather so you're not handing out pamphlets to the wrong kid or having discussions with the kid who is not at risk. Is this going to ensure that happens? No, but it's much, much better than flailing around wondering why our street ed isn't producing any supportive knowledge, attitude, and belief in risky kids. All right? Besides all of those questions about what do we change about what we do to ensure we get our pathways stronger, we still have this issue of no matter how strong my pathways are, what's going on in the larger environment that could be getting in my way. And again, we identified a few moderating factors that would really undo our best efforts. One was cultural norms, at least in some groups of risky kids, are not supportive of parent discussion. So my objective for that, I turn it on its head. By a date to be known, riskiest kids are engaging in discussion with a parent or an adult role model. When we decided what we could possibly do as a mitigating action to get around this killer assumption, we had a whole bunch of discussion about that, I guarantee you. Now we turn that into a strategy. And two things I'm going to highlight that probably came out of the discussion. Identify community champions in cultural subgroups where that parent role is not appropriate for discussing these kinds of behaviors. or identify community champions and surrogates who can either replace the parent or explain to the parent why they really need to play that role, hard as it may be and difficult as it may be. Identifying measures is a third use of this. So a lot of times I do strategic planning for people, and I feel like I've really, really crushed it because I gave them a strategic plan. And the answer always comes back, well, yes, but we need measures, we need measures. How are we going to show any of this is happening? Well, again, this is such a short hop, skip, and a jump if you've gotten through the strategic plan as we just laid it out. Right? Basically, every objective just needs to be converted very simply into an outcome measure because the objectives almost always are inspired by our outcomes, and every strategy needs to be accompanied by a process measure, some measure that shows that the strategy was implemented. As we said earlier, if I've had the output discussion, I pretty much have that process measure. The output discussion said, how do I need to do those activities well? We've encapsulated that in the strategy, and that's probably the thing we're going to measure. Did, in fact, the strategy get implemented like we said it would? On the objective, we've changed that outcome into an objective by stating what the outcome that we're aiming for is. We simply turn that into a measure, and that gives us the dashboard we're going to follow to see if our strategic plan is working. Right? And then finally, affirming mission and vision. Let me spend just a few minutes on that. I don't do mission and visioning a lot in the strategic planning discussions I have because invariably it leads to more wordsmithing than is worth the time and effort. But nevertheless, traditionally in strategic planning, people want to have a mission and vision. So let me end by showing you how the road mapping discussion helps you cut into the chase on that and avoid a lot of the endless wordsmithing that goes on when you just do those in narrative. So part of the problem is the ways in which the words mission and vision are used. They're used very differently depending upon who your strategic planning resource is or your strategic planning consultant is. When we think about them in a roadmappy way, let me tell you a way I've seen as helpful. So I see the vision as how the world will be different because of our program. And again, I don't mean the world, it means the context, the population, or whatever. So a vision kind of answers the question, a world with or a world without. And where's that going to live? It's going to live on the right side of your logic model. The mission, by contrast, gets at if that world is going to be different, what is it that I'm bringing to the puzzle, and what are the major pathways that I'm going to push with my efforts? And so that's going to live in the intermediate outcomes on the one hand, and it's always going to live over on some or all of the major activities in the logic model to achieve them. So the vision is the ideal state of the world we aspire to and the big lever we hope to influence. So that's always going to be over on the right side of the model, right? The mission is going to be on the right side of the model, but some kind of intermediate outcome. What's that big accountable outcome we're trying to push? And the mission is going to be what are the activities and outputs that most relate to accomplishing that accountable outcome, right? So let's look at east side as our final example. The vision is going to live somewhere over on the right-hand side for sure, and I bet it's going to be some agglomeration of a world where there's decreased incidence of HIV and AIDS, and a world where there's less HIV and AIDS because kids are dropping risky behaviors or adopting protective ones. And sure enough, that's what we have. Even the riskiest kids in our community do not get HIV because they know and avoid risky behaviors. I've got that vision, that big goal on the right-hand side, but I end that vision with because the world is different because my accountable outcome has been achieved. Nothing here about how I'm going to do it, just how's the world going to be different. The mission, by contrast, starts off with that accountable outcome. The HIV behavior of targeted youth or the riskiest youth is going to decrease because I'm doing some or all of this good stuff on the left-hand side. And that's what's going to go into my mission. Sure enough, risky kids avoid risk behaviors. I don't need to get into HIV and AIDS goes down. I've already named that in the vision. There's no HIV and AIDS because risky kids are adopting protective behaviors and avoiding risk behaviors. In the mission, I'm saying, and how the heck is it that these risky kids start avoiding risk behaviors? Because here's what I do. A multifaceted campaign that ensures schools, peers, and community norms reinforce protective behaviors. Now, I made this up. You may look at that logic model and come up with a completely different formulation of the mission. That's perfectly acceptable so long as the first part says, here's the accountable outcome that's going to be driven, and it's going to be driven by this agglomeration and restatement of the big things I'm going to do. Right? So in closing, let me close with something you're probably familiar with. The gods condemned Sisyphus to endlessly roll a rock up a hill, whence it would return each time to its starting place. The gods thought with some reason there was no punishment more severe than eternally futile labor. I say that because the purpose of this road mapping is to keep us from walking in a circle by knowing the lighthouse in the distance, and the purpose of this road mapping is to give us a systematic way of unpacking how we get there so that we don't spend our lives pushing the rock up the hill. With that, let me turn to a few resources that you can use post-webinar to help you through this process. Right? First and foremost, request a program consult. The staff of PPEO loves doing these consults. We have a quick and dirty way of cutting to the chase on them. A simple visit will help you figure out if what we can do as consultation can help you or not. Secondly, this webinar is being converted into a self-guided manual that you can use without our consultation, and that's in progress. Thirdly, there's a companion webinar called Learning to Love Your Logic Model, which talks about logic models in more detail as roadmaps, although it doesn't get into the detail we did today about harvesting them for strategic check-ins. And then finally, here's 3 easy ways to get more information. Contact myself or my deputy, Dan Kidder. Contact us directly on the global, or go to the PPEO Evaluation Team intranet site, which has recently been upgraded. So thank you for your time. I hope this has been useful. Again, just feel free to consult us or to contact us for more information.